Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Dr. Arak Verma from IIT Kanpur and we are in the third week of the course. As you know, we have been talking about speech production and comprehension in this week. In the first three lectures, I talked about various aspects of speech production, and in the last lecture, I talked a little bit about the motor theory of speech perception, basically trying to understand how speech perception actually functions. In today's lecture, I will continue on the same plane and I will talk to you further more about the motor theory of speech production, also basically something referred to as the mirror neuron theory. So, the mirror neurons basically are a set of neurons that have tried to explain how the motor theory might be actually instantiated in the brain. I will come to that in a bit, and then we will also talk about some other theories of speech production that are in some sense in let us say opposition to, or they are in some sense contrary to the suggestions of the motor theory of speech perception. So, we will see talk about some aspects of motor theory of speech production, we will see some of the objections to the motor theory of speech production, some of the criticisms that it has got. Also then we will kind of also examine some of the other theories of speech perception. Okay. So, that will be about today's lecture. So, let us start. Now, there is this whole concept of mirror neurons which has been around for over 2 to 3 decades now and is one of the very popular concepts in cognitive neuroscience. And this whole concept of mirror neuron basically comes from basically first came from the research that was being done with monkeys, and it so happened that there was this researcher in whose lab they had monkeys and they were trying to in a single cell recording sort of paradigm, wherein you cut open the brain of the monkey and you insert a particular electrode, and that electrode records the electrical activity in the neurons. Now basically that electrode is the electrodes are placed that it can record activity from a set of neurons or a range of these neurons, and what they discovered was that there were these particular neurons that were firing when the monkey was actually eating the food. Also some of these neurons actually fired when the monkey was observing somebody else eating the food. So, there was this lab assistant or researcher that was there, and the researcher was probably after a day of experimentation gotten hungry, he was starting to eat the banana and he heard this loud chirping noise. So, basically the electrodes were also were basically being interpreted as some sort of a noise pattern, so that when the electric activity is observed, the researchers can look at it, okay, where is this coming from. So, the person is eating a banana and he hears this neurons firing, and he kind of does this again and again and notices that there is this bunch of neurons that not only fire when the monkey is itself doing the action, but they also fire while observing the action. Okay. So, these set of neurons were referred to as mirror neurons, and the basic function of the mirror neurons that was prescribed was that of imitation. Now, how do you do imitation? If you see me waving this hand, and if you want to wave the hand, you have to kind of be able to some program in your head should be able to tell you how exactly it is that I am waving my hand. This function is basically what is broadly achieved by the mirror neurons. I am not really a cognitive neuroscientist to tell you a lot detail about this, but this is precisely what might be happening. Now, the existence of mirror neurons in monkeys was, as I said, established by this invasive single cell recording technique, and that is not really plausible for doing with humans. No committee would give you ethical clearance for recording activity by recording single cell activity by inserting the electrodes into somebody else's head. Recently I had a friend come over and he told me that for some patients where epileptic surgeries are due, they still kind of can get the patients in a state where they can record this, but that is not a norm, that is not something that you can actually do. Okay. So, the part of the brain of the monkey's brain, the part of the monkey's brain which had the mirror neurons, especially the area F5 of the monkey's brain, is actually similar to the Broca's area of the human brain. The Broca's area is the area that basically is responsible for production of speech. So, let us say this is the area which is in the inferior frontal lobe, basically in the motor cortex itself, and this is the area that is supposed to be responsible for controlling all our articulatory processes. All the motor activity related to production of speech is handled by Broca's area. So, if you have a damage in Broca's area, you will probably not be able to produce speech normally or not at all. Okay, we will talk about that in a later lecture. So, neuroimaging research involving direct recording from neurons in the Broca's area have both shown that it participates in speech perception as well. Usually it is involved in speech production, should be involved in speech production, that speech production being a motor act, but it has been shown via neuroimaging research that Broca's area is also activated while somebody is listening to speech. Now that sounds a little bit similar to what the mirror neuron would do, because while the person is listening to somebody speak, it is also making up how should I be able to speak the same way. Okay, so the mirror neurons in their way of imitation probably would try to recreate or slash simulate the sound that the person is hearing. Researchers who discovered the mirror neurons have proposed that the mirror neurons could be the neurological mechanism that the motor theory of speech perception requires to instantiate in the human brain. If you remember from the last lecture, the motor theory of speech perception said that in order to really understand speech perception, one of the better things to do would be to make out what gestures created the perception. The mirror neurons could exactly be the system that help you understand or get closer to the gesture that a person would have said, made in order to create that particular sound. So that's what the discoverers of mirror neurons propose. They say the mirror neurons could actually be the neurological basis for the motor theory of speech perception to say whatever it says. Okay. So the mirror neuron in the Broca's area could fire when an individual produces a particular set of phonemes 1 or hears the same set of phonemes, providing the bridge between perception and production of speech, or speaking and listening somebody. Experiments have been conducted to sort of in a non-invasive manner figure out whether motor cortex participates in speech perception or whether we have a system similar to the mirror neuron system. Now the motor theory says that accessing the representations of specific speech gestures is what underlies successful speech perception. So they did this experiment. They wanted to do some of these experiments. The representations of speech gestures must be in some sense stored in the brain part that controls the articulatory movements, that is the motor premotor cortex, Broca's area roughly. The parts of the brain that control articulation there in the motor cortex, in the frontal lobes of the brain, and the adjacent premotor cortex when we perceive speech. Okay. Proponents of the mirror neuron theory argue that mirror neurons are the neural mechanism that establish the link between heard speech and motor representations that are responsible for producing speech. So I am just kind of trying to spell out what the assumption here is that we are going to test. Now mirror neurons have also been recently found in the monkey equivalent of the motor cortex. So there is some sort of a confirmation that we have that the human brain also has a system very similar to that of mirror neurons. Okay, the system might be more more specialized as compared to the monkey neuron, but this is something that is there. Now some mirror neuron theorists consequently argue that mirror neurons must be playing a very important role in modern humans because our speech production and perception systems have evolved from a more generic manual gesture system. So there are theories about language evolution. I don't know whether I have discussed, I don't remember at the moment whether I have discussed that in some detail, but the mirror neuron theory broadly talks about that initially when we started to make manual gestures or make tools, that led to making gestures, and that led to eventually vocal gestures. So the making of gestures, which by the way is also something that you could assume is very importantly done by the mirror neuron system. If I make a particular hand gesture, for you to be able to make the exactly same hand gesture could basically be being done by the mirror neuron system. So because the mirror neuron systems were helping you do this, they are probably also now helping you to understand speech. That's the logic that goes. Now is there any evidence for mirror neurons in humans? So yes, they have done some experiments, as I was saying. Pulver, Mueller and colleagues, they did this experiment wherein participants listened to syllables that were either labial plosives pa and ba or alveolar stops st and d. Okay. On silent production trials, participants imagined themselves making the same sounds and neuroimaging brain activity was recorded. Also the same thing happened in listening trials. Okay, so the two trials of trials, silent production, you are not really saying this, but you are in your head saying ba, and I cannot really show you what I am thinking. Okay, so listening to speech also caused substantial activity in the superior part of the temporal lobes on both sides of the participant's brain, but it also caused a lot of activity in the motor cortex in the participant's frontal lobes, those areas that were initially involved in silent production. Brain activity in the motor cortex also depended upon what kinds of sounds were being produced. So, whether these were the bilabial stop or the alveolar stop, okay, pa and ba versus ta and da, because different regions. So, ba and pa basically involves constriction of lips, ta and da involves constriction of air through your tongue at the back of your teeth. Motor theory basically would explain the difference in these results by arguing that the same brain areas that produce speech were also involved in perceiving it. In another study, when TMS was applied to a participant's motor cortex, participants were less able to tell the differences between two similar sounding phonemes. The assumption here is, so TMS is a technique which you can use to temporarily suspend brain activity in designated areas of the brain. So, when they suspended brain activity in the motor cortex, participants' perception of speech was also deficient. That is what is happening. Further, in a different study, when people listen to speech sounds that involve tongue movements and have TMS applied to the parts of the motor cortex that control the tongue, the increased motor evoked potential are observed in participants' tongue muscles. So, when they are listening to people saying sounds that are made using the tongue movement, they also receive similar activity in the areas that control the tongue muscles. Okay. So, that is something that could happen. Now, all of these experiments, the TMS experiment and the second TMS experiment and Pulver-Muller's fMRI experiments, tell us that it is possible that motor cortex is generating some neural activity in response to speech. Okay. And that is the idea that they say is consistent with what the motor theory of speech production had to say. Okay. So, let us see this. Now, till here it is all fine, but say for example, it probably seemed to happen, and also I think Traxler feels that, is that this kind of went a little bit overboard. It kind of they probably stretched it a little too far, and I will show you how. The same kinds of TMS manipulations that led to motor evoked potentials in the tongue muscles were also found to lead to motor evoked potentials in the leg muscles. Okay. So, it is not that only the tongue muscles are receiving activity, it is that the leg muscles are also receiving activity. Now, how do you reconcile these things? You could say, for example, the authors say of the study, they say that speech perception probably depends on an extended language action network, and so if there is going to be activity in the tongue muscles, you can expect some activity in the leg muscles as well. They also propose a link between the non-verbal gestures and speech gestures, and a link between leg movements and tongue movements and manual gestures and so on. But this kind of seems a little bit protracted, does not really seem all right. So, what people have done is they have also questioned this entire TMS MEP research, and they basically have said, say for example, things like if your experimental technique is not giving you exact results, there might be something wrong with the technique, and then the findings that are coming out of this cannot be completely trusted. Okay. So, that is something. On the other hand, say for example, if there is a widespread activity in the entire motor cortex in response to speech, then basically you have to take into account as to what is really happening here, what kind of behavioral responses maybe people preparing to make behavioral responses, which could then involve a lot of wide variety of verbal, non-verbal gestures. So, that could also be the case, that it is not really happening that people are showing responses in the motor cortex because they are perceiving speech, but for a later thing they are preparing for verbal behavioral responses, and that is why in preparation, so the motor activity that is observed could be not in response to perceiving speech, but it could be in response to preparing to do something. Speech is sort of for action, you listen to something and then you want to act, you want to do something, or say for example, a lot of speech basically asks you to do something, come here, go there, those kind of things. Now, an alternate could be that the motor neurons might respond to speech because they are involving in a monitoring and a correction circuit. Maybe the motor neurons are not involved in perception of speech per se, but to monitor and correct speech. If you remember Level's model, there was a feedback loop from once the phonological words were created and also after the sound was actually produced. So, maybe the mirror neurons are kind of doing this part, they are kind of trying to do this. Okay. So, when we speak, the mirror neuron system is monitoring for errors, so that when we say something incorrectly, it can kind of adjust the speech output and account for those errors, correct those errors, so to speak. Okay. So the activity, so it could be said that the activity in the motor cortex, that of mirror neurons, could involve neural circuits that normally respond to the speech perception process by dynamically adjusting speech outputs. That is something that has been produced. Also, moving further, there are other challenges, other kind of criticisms that the motor theory of speech perception has faced. Let us kind of look into that. Now, some challenges to the motor theory are rooted in the strong connection that it makes between perception and production. If you read closely what the motor theory of speech perception has to say, it kind of makes perception of speech contingent to production of speech and vice versa. So, they say there should be a very strong link between perception and production. But if you see babies, for example, babies are capable of doing categorical perception, perceiving the differences in different kinds of speech sounds, although they are not able to produce a lot of speech sounds. So, the idea is because of the connection, strong connection that the motor theory of speech perception makes between production and perception, how is it possible that the babies who are not able to produce anything and their motor areas do not have programs ready for producing anything can still perceive categorically different kinds of phonemes? Okay. So, to account for these results, either we say that infants are also born with an innate set of speech motor representations that they will eventually use to produce these sounds, or a simpler definition is that these two are not as closely linked with each other as the motor theory of speech perception has to say. Additional experiments, moving further, have also cast doubt on whether speech motor representations are necessary for perception of speech. Say for example, it has also been shown, documented, that non-human animals, quails or chinchillas, do also have a supply of speech motor representations. You cannot really say that because they also do categorical perception in very similar ways as humans would do. Okay. Once they are trained to respond to one class of speech sounds and refrain from responding to another class, they demonstrate aspects of speech perception that resemble human performance. So, it is basically in the same way that humans would perceive speech sounds, and these animals can also do that. So, do these animals have speech motor representations? If yes, why do they not speak like us? If no, kind of too much to say that these have speech motor representations much as we have. So, that is a bit of a stretch, I would say. Now, because these animals lack the human articulatory apparatus, they cannot have speech motor representations, but as they respond to aspects of speech very much like humans do, the motor theories claim that there is a very strong connection between the speech perception modules and speech production modules, kind of feels a little bit overstretched. Further research also, the third class of evidence for this, further research with aphasic patients also casts further doubts on the motor theory. Okay, aphasic patients are patients which have damage in the articulatory areas, the Broca's areas basically. Okay, and also a different kind of aphasia could be Wernicke's aphasia. We will talk about that in some of the later lectures, is where you have a problem in the perception of speech area. So, there is Broca's area, there is Wernicke's area. Broca's area is the responsible for speech production. Wernicke's area is responsible for speech comprehension. What happens is sometimes this area is damaged, speech perception is running fine, sometimes this area is damaged and speech production is running fine. So, there is a sort of a double dissociation that is being demonstrated, telling us that speech production and perception might not be as closely linked as the motor theory has to say. Okay. Also, speech perception required access to intact motor representations, then brain damaged patients who have impaired spoken language output should also have impaired spoken language comprehension, which does not appear to be the case most often. Okay. So, these are some of the doubts, these are some of the problems with the motor theory of speech perception. There is another set of doubts also, is that there is many a times there is usually a many to one mapping between gestures and phonemes. So, initially if you remember, I was saying, and Alvin Lieberman has proposed that gestures are more faithful to phonemes, they are a better way to listen or identify different phonemes from each other. However, people have shown and they have demonstrated that there is a many to one mapping with this. So, many different gestures can be used to produce one kind of phoneme, and many different kinds of phonemes can be used, can be basically produced by just the same gesture. So there is this many to one mapping, and now this kind of complicates the story a lot, because how will you then differentiate, or the whole premise of motor theory kind of could work if there were one gesture and one phoneme only possible. As soon as you show that there are one gestures can create many phonemes, or many gestures can create one phoneme, now you are in a soup. You cannot really use the gesture to decipher what phoneme was sent, or the phoneme to decipher what gesture was made, and that is also one of the problems with this motor theory. So this means that there is no single syllable for single gesture for the syllable like g. Consequently, studies involving the production of the bite block vowels. Bite block vowels is basically you give somebody something to chew and keep in their mouth while they are producing the vowels. They also kind of show that very different gestures can lead to the same or nearly the same set of phonemes. The thing I was trying to say. The motor theory attempts to account for this in one of two ways. It says either more than one speech motor representation goes with a given phoneme, or there is a single set of prototypes of speech motor representations, and that an acoustic analysis of speech signals determines which of these gestures would be correlated. Both of them will kind of violate the whole spirit of this theory of motor theory of speech perception, and in that sense only makes it weaker and not stronger. Okay, so I think we saw the motor theory of speech perception in some detail. We also saw some of the evidences for and against either of the either of the theories from the beginning. What do we end up with? We end up with saying that maybe the motor theory is not the best candidate theory to explain how speech perception really happens. If that is not, there must be other theories. So let us move to another theory of speech perception, that is the general auditory theory of speech perception. Now the general auditory theory of speech perception kind of says that speech perception per se is not really a very special task. It is not really something that needs a special speech module, as the motor theory people were saying. It says that speech sounds are perceived using the same mechanisms of audition and perceptual learning that have evolved in humans to handle all other kinds of sounds. So it does not really propose or postulate a different speech processing module. It says speech processing can also happen using the general auditory module that is anyways dealing with all kinds of incoming acoustic stimulation. That is the idea. Researchers in this tradition have looked for consistent patterns in acoustic signal for speech that appear whenever particular speech properties are present. So the idea is you are kind of now analyzing speech in terms of how common or how consistent it is with other modalities of perception of speech. So they seek to explain commonalities in the way different people and even different species react to acoustic stimulation. Okay. So some studies have looked at the way people and even animals respond to voicing contrasts. I have been telling you about the pa and ba example. We said that ba is voiced, pa is not voiced. That is the basic difference between these two sounds. Both are say for example labial stops. Okay. These studies have suggested that our ability to perceive voicing is related to the fundamental properties of the auditory system. The fundamental property of the auditory system is to analyze speech in terms of these voice onset times, and this is the variation in those voice onset times is what leads us to perceiving ba and pa. So the fundamental property is what we can tell apart two sounds, whether two sounds occurred simultaneously and whether if they became more than 20 milliseconds apart from each other. If two sounds are presented within 20 milliseconds of each other, we will perceive them as being simultaneous in time or maybe even as the same category. If one starts 20 milliseconds before or after the other, we perceive them as occurring in a sequence as different phonemes. The voicing boundary for people and quail is right at the same point. If vocal fold vibrations start within 20 milliseconds of the burst, we perceive the phoneme as voiced, as ba. But if there is more than a 20 milliseconds gap between the burst and the vocal fold vibration, we perceive an unvoiced stop, that is a pa. So exactly the same kind of way both humans and quails are perceiving ba and pa, which kind of tells us that it could be a very generic mechanism that the auditory system has, and one that we also share with other species of animals. So this aspect of phonological perception then could be based on a very fundamental property of the auditory perception mechanism rather than the peculiarities of the gestures that go into voicing and producing voiced and unvoiced sounds. The general auditory perception theory, or the general auditory approach, also does, however, it does not really offer an explanation of the full range of human or animal speech perception capability. Its main advantage basically lies in its ability to explain common characteristics of human and non-human speech perception and production. So it's a generic theory in spirit. Now, since the theory is not committed to gestures as the fundamental unit of phonological representations, it is not vulnerable to a lot of criticism that we discussed with respect to the motor theory of speech perception. So, it kind of saves itself from all of that. Moving further, there is another theory of speech perception we can talk about before we end this discussion, and that is the fuzzy logic model of speech perception. Now, the fuzzy logic model is a very interesting model. It basically says that it kind of is within the general auditory kind of theories, but incorporates the idea that a single set of prototypical representation for speech sounds are there, which are determined by their acoustic characteristics. So, there is a prototype version of different kinds of sounds, and basically what we need to do is figure out whether something is a member of that prototype or not, and that will help us distinguish between different kinds of sounds. According to the fuzzy logic model of speech perception basically reflects the outcome of two kinds of processes. One is the bottom up processes and the other is the top down processes. Let us look at this in more detail. The bottom up processes are those mental representations that analyze the acoustic properties of a given stimulus, and these processes basically are responsible for activating a set of potentially matching phonological representations. So, as soon as you are hearing the incoming speech stimulus, there is this process in your head that is activating the matching speech stimulus. As soon as the match is made, you say you recognize that speech sound and you have a way to create that speech sound. It shows representations of phonemes, and it says that the stored representations of phonemes are activated to the degree that they are similar to the acoustic properties of the incoming stimulus. More similar phonemes achieve higher degrees of activation and less similar phonemes would receive lower degrees of activation. That is how the selection process really goes. The other kinds of processes could be the top down processes. Now, top down processes are mental operations that use information in the long term memory, information from your experience. You learn to hear so many things, and that gets stored in your head, and when the incoming stimulus is you're hearing, you're trying to look for matching things in the long term memory. Okay, and basically on the basis of that, it tries to select the best possible candidate from among the set of candidates activated by the bottom up process. So, you could be hearing something and not be really sure of what you've heard. So, you look at the context, you look at your long term memory, and you will try and see, acha, this is what this person might have probably said, something that you would do in a very noisy place, or something that you would do if you have a very disturbed phone line, or so to speak. Okay. So, this may be especially important if the incoming information, as I am saying, is ambiguous or degraded. When the N phoneme precedes the B sound, so people say lean bacon, if you say lean bacon, lean bacon, lean bacon again and again, sometimes the because of the co-articulation effects, people would perceive the N sound as the M sound. So, some people would report hearing lean bacon instead of lean bacon, okay, because of co-articulation and other kind of speech, speaker specific effects. So, when someone listens to lean bacon, bottom up processes will activate both the prototypes N and M, and the top down process will tell you that there is no such word called lean bacon. So, this must be lean bacon, and it kind of narrows down to what exactly has to be said. Alright. So, according to this fuzzy logic model of speech perception, our knowledge that lean bacon is the likely representation in English should cause us to select better. Okay. However, if the N sound were in a non-word such as split bacon, a listener would be more likely to favor the M interpretation, because the opening sound would not receive any support. The N sound will not receive any support from whatever is already stored in your head. This kind of effect, this tendency to perceive the ambiguous speech stimuli as real words, is referred to as the Ganong effect. Okay. If you remember, we had a similar effect while we are talking about speech errors, that we produce more real words even as part of speech errors as compared to non-words. Similarly, this is in the domain of perception, that if we are hearing something and if you are not really very sure of that, we are more likely to take an impression that this could be an actual word rather than a non-word, because people do not utter non-words usually, isn't it? So this is this. Also, the fuzzy logic model of speech perception can explain what is called the phonemic restoration effects. You remember what phonemic restoration is? Phonemic restoration is if there is something missing in the signal, you try and fill up that signal on the basis of your knowledge, the top-down processes. So there was this very interesting experiment I can remember, wherein there's this participant. The participant has a headphone, and the headphone, the sentence is going like, the legislatures and something something something, and that exact point where S sound is there, there is a huge coughing sound. So the participant basically actually only hears leggy coughing sound latures. There is no S that the participant hears in the signal, but when the participants are later asked, all of them report hearing the S very clearly. How is it happening? It's probably happening because the top-down processes, as prescribed by the fuzzy logic model of speech perception, are filling this up. It happens all the time. When you're in a very loud place, you still kind of maybe not exactly hearing everything cleanly, but you kind of still make sense of what is being said, because there is also this aid of your long-term memory. You sort of know, acha, what could have been said, what is the closest candidate that this person might be talking about, and that kind of really works all right. Okay. So these phonemic restoration effects are stronger for longer words than for shorter words, because obviously you get more time in judging and all of that, and they are stronger for sentences that are grammatical and make sense rather than ungrammatical sentence, because the context needs to be mostly intact in order for you to be able to make these assumptions correctly. Okay. Further, the specific phoneme that is restored can depend upon the meaning of the sentence. There is this example, for example, if you hear the wagon lost its eel, okay, what will you basically make? You probably make that, okay, because we are talking of the wagon, we are probably going to talk about the wheel. So wagon lost its wheel. Okay, but suppose, for example, you hear something like the circus has a trained calf and eel, you will basically most likely hear the phoneme S. So if it's the circuses probably have seals, and I mean this is an American text. So circuses probably have seal, or different kinds of animals. So you are probably more likely to assume that seal would have been said, because the context necessitates seal. Only kind of animal that the circuses might have with an onset of S and with the ending eel is probably a seal. So that's why you'll kind of you'll be more biased to going towards seal rather than wheel. All right. So there have been a lot of researchers involving ERPs have shown that nervous system does register the presence of the cough noise very soon after it appears in the stimulus. So it's not that you're not hearing the coughing sound, you're basically getting around the coughing sound. Okay. All of these suggest that a variety of possible sources of top-down information may be getting scanned, and it may be affecting the way incoming speech is being perceived. Further, they suggest that the perception of speech involves analyzing the signal itself as well as biasing the results of this analysis based on how well different candidate representations are activated and they fit in the other aspects of the message. You saw in this example, the wagon lost its wheel versus the circus has a trained seal. Basically, seal fits in very well there with the local context of the sentence, and in the global context that it is a circus. Okay. Similarly, the wheel fits in very well with the local context that it is a wagon. All right. So these, and there are other aspects that could include whether phonological representations result in real world or not, and whether the semantic interpretations of the sentence make sense, and all of these sources of information could be combined together to amount to what top-down information is. So basically what the fuzzy logic model of speech perception says is that you are analyzing speech not really by a general speech perception module or something. You basically have a set of possible candidates. The set of possible candidates basically are used to kind of activate candidates for whatever you are hearing. So this is the bottom-up processes, and the top-down knowledge that you have, experience that you have with speech, helps you select the correct thing. So a combination of the top-down and the bottom-up processes is what is leading you to correct perception of speech more often than not. Okay. So, this is I think all that I would have to say on speech perception. We had these 2 lectures wherein we talked about a couple of theories, I think 3 or 4 theories of speech perception, and in a sense what you can kind of conclude is that speech perception is a rather sophisticated act. It involves also on top of kind of understanding the gestures and stuff, that might be partially true, but it also kind of involves other processes as well. It's something that is generically available, and it kind of probably needs some help from your memory and your other kinds of analysis that you would be doing on incoming speech. I hope this week with respect to speech production and comprehension was intelligible to you, and you would have followed the lectures. If not, you can always ask questions in the forum. Thank you.